It's been
The
an
air
honor,
in the
truly.
Grand Celestial Ballroom, perched
We're so
77
proud of
floors
you.
above the glittering nervous system of
many more
Manhattan,
successes.
was a finely tuned instrument.
It's
It
been an
hummed with
honor,
the delicate
truly.
dissonance of clinking champagne
We're so
flutes,
proud
the
of
murmur
you.
of stock prices,
To
and
many
summer
more
plans in the
successes.
Hamptons, and the distant, polite strains of a string quartet playing something vaguely Vivaldi. It was an atmosphere spun from gold and privilege, so rarefied that the slightest impurity felt like a violation. Tonight, that impurity was Kesha Williams. She moved through the opulent space like a ghost, her presence acknowledged only by the briefest flicker of annoyance in the eyes of the city's elite as she knelt to retrieve a fallen canap napkin or wipe a phantom smudge from the Italian marble. Her uniform, a drab grey smock over black trousers, was a cloak of invisibility. At 35, Kesha had mastered the art of being unseen, of folding her 5'9" frame into the background, a necessary skill for a contract cleaner navigating the gilded cages of the 1%. For 3 weeks, this had been her world. A nocturnal tour of Thompson Holdings' new skyscraper, a monument of steel and glass that scraped the heavens, culminating in this, its christening party. A party for them, a job for her. Her mind was a million miles away, cataloguing the inventory for the next floor's cleaning supplies, when her foot caught on the carelessly discarded velvet rope of a stanchion. Time seemed to warp, stretching into a syrupy, horrifying slow motion. The heavy crystal tray, laden with a dozen flutes of Dom Perignon, tilted in her hands. She saw the trajectory of its fall, a graceful, parabolic arc of doom. She saw the faces of the guests turning towards her, their expressions morphing from bored indifference to horrified glee. The tray hit the floor not with a simple crash, but with an explosive, deafening symphony of destruction. It was the sound of 1,000 tiny bells being shattered at once, a percussive shockwave that ripped through the ballroom's delicate harmony and brought it to a dead, ringing halt. Silence. 200 pairs of eyes, a constellation of judgment, fixed on the black woman kneeling amidst a battlefield of broken crystal and spreading champagne. The Vivaldi died with a scratch of bows. The murmurs ceased. In that moment, Kesha was no longer invisible. She was the focal point of all their contempt, a stain on their perfect evening. And then, a voice, slurred with whiskey and arrogance, sliced through the quiet. "If you can dance this waltz, I'll marry my son to you." The voice belonged to William Thompson III, the patriarch of the Thompson Empire, a man whose portrait hung in the lobby below, radiating a benevolent tyranny. He stood near the grand piano, his face florid, his silver hair impeccably He sneered, a deliberate, theatrical expression designed for an audience, and pointed his own champagne glass at Kesha as if she were a curious specimen under a microscope. Laughter, at first tentative, then swelling into a cruel rolling wave, filled the void. Kesha's hands, which had automatically begun to gather the larger, more dangerous shards of glass, trembled almost imperceptibly. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the sharp edges, glittering like malevolent diamonds in the recessed lighting. Each sliver of glass was a reflection of a face in the crowd, a distorted mask of mockery. Humiliation was a familiar ghost, a companion, in her life for the last 15 years. But this felt different. This was a public crucifixion. "Dad, you're being ridiculous," a voice whispered urgently beside the magnate. Jonathan Thompson, 28 years old, the designated heir to the throne, looked mortified. His face, usually a mask of youthful confidence, was pale, his eyes pleading with his father. He wore his tailored suit like a cage, a garment of inherited power that he seemed profoundly uncomfortable with. William waved a dismissive hand, completely ignoring his son. His focus was on the stage he had just created, and he was its gleeful director. "No, no, let me finish," he boomed, striding towards the center of the room, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the broken crystal. He moved with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no. "This person obviously doesn't have the coordination to clean properly. How about we test her to see if she can even move to the beat?" Kesha continued her work, her movements methodical. Pick up a shard, place it carefully on the unbroken corner of the tray, avoid the gaze of the vultures. But beneath the practiced subservience, a cold, still center was forming within her. It was a place she hadn't visited in a long, long time. It wasn't fear or shame that filled her. It was a slow, calculating rage, as clear and hard as the crystal she was gathering. She was evaluating every word, every cruel laugh, every condescending glance, filing them away like data points in a complex equation. The event manager, a harried man named Stevens, with a perpetually sweating brow, scurried forward. "Mr. Thompson, perhaps it would be better nothing." William cut him off, his voice a whip crack. He gestured dramatically to the stunned musicians. "Play a waltz. If she can dance better than my wife, I'll marry my son to her on the spot. Just imagine, the heir to the Thompson fortune marrying the cleaning lady." The collective laughter crescendoed, echoing off the 30-foot ceilings like a wave of collective cruelty. It was a bizarre, ugly sound, a chorus of privilege celebrating its own perceived superiority. Several women, draped in couture and dripping with diamonds, covered their mouths in performative shock, their eyes dancing with malicious delight. The men shook their heads, some with a feigned disapproval that barely concealed their amusement. It was a perfectly acceptable comedy of bad taste, a harmless diversion at the expense of a nobody. Finally, Kesha's hands were full of glittering debris. She rose slowly, her spine straightening with a deliberate grace that seemed at odds with her drab uniform. She wiped her hands on her apron, a simple, practical gesture that somehow felt profound in its dignity. Then, she lifted her head and looked directly at William Thompson for a moment that stretched into an eternity. She said nothing. The ballroom held its breath. In her silence there was a power that unnerved them. She was no longer just the object of their ridicule. She was a participant, weighing a decision that they could not comprehend. Her eyes, a deep, liquid brown, held a history no one in that room could ever decipher. They had seen the blinding glare of stage lights, the adoring faces of thousands in velvet-lined theaters from Moscow to Milan. They had seen the sterile white walls of a hospital room, and the pity in a doctor's expression as he delivered a life-shattering verdict. Right now, they saw a drunken bully and an opportunity. "I accept," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the air like a shard of the very glass she had just been cleaning. It was clear, steady, and utterly devoid of the fear or deference they expected. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier and more profound than before. The orchestra, which had been nervously shuffling sheet music, froze. The laughter died in 200 throats. William Thompson blinked, his drunken bravado momentarily faltering. The script had been flipped. The prop was talking back. "What did you say?" he asked, a flicker of genuine confusion in his eyes. "I said, I accept your challenge," Kesha repeated. A subtle, enigmatic smile touched her lips. A sight so unexpected it sent an inexplicable shiver through some of the onlookers. "But when I dance better than your wife, you will keep your word, even if it was said as a joke." Now, the laughter that returned was different. It was louder, more forced, laced with incredulity. This was no longer just a joke. It was a spectacle of delusion. The cleaning lady thought she could dance. The sheer audacity was, to them, the punchline. Amidst the renewed mockery, no one noticed the familiar, predatory gleam in Kesha's eyes. It was the same gleam that had mesmerized critics and captivated audiences on the world's most prestigious stages. The look of a performer who owned the space she was in, whether it was the stage of the Bolshoi or a marble floor littered with the remnants of their arrogance. It was the look of Kesha Moreau. Woman with venomous grace, detached herself from the crowd. Victoria Thompson, 50 years old, preserved by a regimen of Pilates, plastic surgery, and the effortless comfort of immense wealth, glided to her husband's side. She was known for two things: her charity galas and the ballroom dancing lessons she gave to the wives of Manhattan's other titans. "Darling, do you really think I need to lower myself to compete with this?" Victoria purred, gesturing dismissively towards Kesha with a hand weighed down by a canary diamond the size of a quail's egg. Her smile was a masterpiece of condescending pity. "Don't be modest, Victoria," William replied, his good humor restored by his wife's support. He was back in control. "You won the Metropolis Club Waltz trophy last year. There should be more than enough for this little demonstration." Kesha watched them, a silent observer to her own public trial. Her mind, however, was not in the ballroom. It had leaped back 15 years, shedding the drab gray uniform and the weight of a decade and a half of anonymity. She was on stage at the Kennedy Center, the heat of the lights on her skin, the scent of rosin and sweat in the air. She was Kesha Moreau, principal dancer of the American National Ballet. She felt the ghost of a tutu around her waist, the phantom security of point shoes on her feet. She remembered the thunderous ovations that felt like a physical force, the reviews that had exhausted their superlatives, comparing her to Pavlova, to Fontaine. She remembered the feeling of flight, of defying gravity and narrative with nothing but muscle, bone, and soul. And then, just as vividly, she remembered the end, a special performance for a political delegation. The rain-slicked ribbon of the George Washington Parkway, the blinding glare of headlights crossing the median, the horrifying screech of metal tearing metal 3 months lost to the grey twilight of a coma, followed by a cruel sunlit awakening. The doctor's voice, kind but firm, explaining the intricate damage to her left leg, the shattered tibia, the shredded ligaments, the nerve damage that was, in his words, catastrophic. She would be lucky, he'd said, to walk without a limp. Dance professionally. Impossible. A word that had slammed the door on her entire world. Jonathan, William barked, turning to his son, who still hovered at the edge of the scene, his face a mask of impotent misery. Go get your camera. I want to record this moment for posterity. The day a cleaning lady tried to pass herself off as a dancer at my party. Jonathan flinched. Dad, this has gone too far. The girl was just doing her job. The girl, William cut him off, his voice dripping with sarcasm, accepted the challenge. Now she's going to entertain us, or would you rather I tell your pretty little fiancé about that embarrassing situation in the Hamptons last week? The one with the caterer's daughter. Jonathan's face went bone white. The color drained from his cheeks as if a plug had been pulled. Kesha saw it clearly now. Blackmail, crude, simple, and brutally effective. It was another brick in the toxic edifice of William Thompson's control over his family, his company, his world. Jonathan, defeated, slowly pulled out his phone, his hands shaking slightly. Put the music on, William commanded the DJ who had replaced the string quartet. And place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. Place your bets. $500 for those who think my wife will win. $1,000 for any brave soul willing to bet on the help. A fresh wave of cruel, excited chatter rippled through the room. Wallets were produced. Men with smug expressions handed crisp bills to a beaming William Thompson, who was now acting as a boisterous, gleeful bookie. They were treating a human being's dignity as a spectator sport. A novelty wager at the racetrack. Victoria positioned herself in the center of the dance floor, which staff were now hastily clearing of the remaining glass. She performed a few theatrical stretches, a shallow ply and a delicate point of her toe, designed to showcase her supposed expertise. She was the picture of refined elegance, the champion of the Metropolis Club, ready to defend her honor against a clumsy servant. William, his pockets bulging with bet money, swaggered over to Kesha. He leaned in close, his breath a foul mix of expensive whiskey and schadenfreude. You know, he said, his voice a low conspiratorial growl, when you lose and you will lose you will lose I want you to get down on your knees and apologize. Apologize for wasting everyone's time. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. And then, obviously, you're fired. It was then that the cold, still center inside Kesha crystallized into something unbreakably hard. The calculated rage ignited. The years of swallowing her pride, of accepting her diminished circumstances, of mourning the life that had been stolen from her, it all coalesced into a single point of incandescent resolve. This was not about a job anymore. It was not even about the humiliation. It was about reclaiming a piece of the soul they were trying to grind under their heels. She looked up at him, her eyes holding his. The calm in her gaze was more unsettling than any outburst could have been. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice so steady it seemed to vibrate with an unseen power. When I win and I will win, I want you to keep your word about the marriage. She saw the flicker of amusement in his eyes and pressed on before he could speak. But I also want something else. William raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. He was enjoying this. The sheer nerve of her was the evening's finest entertainment. Oh, she wants to make demands now. Very well. Amuse me. What else could you possibly want, besides trapping my son in a laughable marriage? I want you to admit, in front of all these guests, that you judged a woman wrongly based on the color of her skin and the work she does. Kesha stated, her voice resonating with a quiet authority that hushed the nearest guests. And I want a public apology. The atmosphere in the ballroom tensed. The joke had curdled. This was no longer a light-hearted bit of cruelty. It had veered into the dangerous territory of race, class, and genuine consequence. Whispers rustled through the crowd like dry leaves. This had become far more serious than they had bargained for. William Thompson stared at her for a long moment, then threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming, ugly sound. You've got guts, I'll give you that, he finally said, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. All right, you're on, I accept. But when you make a fool of yourself, you'll leave here not only without a job, but without a shred of dignity left. What William Thompson III, in his cocoon of wealth and power, could not possibly know was that he was not facing a cleaner with a mysterious past. He was facing a woman who had already lost everything a person could lose. A woman who had died and been reborn in fire. A woman who knew, with the certainty of a survivor, exactly how hard one had to fight for every crumb of respect in a world that had already written her off. While Victoria prepared with her practiced country club waltz steps, a silent storm was brewing across the dance floor, because there is a profound and brutal difference between someone who learned to dance as a hobby and someone who was born to make dance a universal language. Even when fate had tried to silence her forever, Kasia remained motionless in a corner of the vast, empty dance floor. To the casual observer, she looked frozen, perhaps with fear, but her mind was a whirlwind of activity, a precision machine kicking back to life after years of dormancy. 15 years of brutal physical therapy, 15 years of reteaching every muscle, every tendon, how to function, 15 years of learning to walk again without a limp, an achievement that had felt as monumental as any sold-out performance. She had forged a resilience in the quiet desperation of those years that no one in this room, with their inherited fortunes and manufactured problems, could ever possibly comprehend. Look at her. A woman in a shimmering sequined dress whispered to her friend, loud enough for Kasia to hear. She's probably never stepped on a proper dance floor in her life. What an unnecessary humiliation. William Thompson continued his predatory circuit of the room, collecting the last of the bets, his voice booming with false magnanimity. $500 says she can't even make it through the song without tripping, he announced, raising his glass in a toast to his own cruelty. 1,000 for anyone who bets she run out crying in the middle of her performance. That laughter echoed, but Kasia noticed something William didn't. His son, Jonathan, wasn't laughing. He was leaning against a marble pillar near the wall, his posture radiating discomfort. He avoided everyone's gaze, his eyes fixed on the floor, his jaw tight with a tension that was part shame, part fury. It was then that a flicker of recognition sparked in Kasia's mind. She had seen that face before, that quiet kindness that seemed so out of place in this family. In her 3 weeks working the night shifts, a young executive had occasionally passed through, always offering a polite good evening or a simple thank you to the cleaning and security staff. The others looked through them, but he saw them. It was him, Jonathan. Miss, a low, gravelly voice said beside her. Kasia turned. Standing there was a man in his 60s, his broad shoulders filling out the discreet, dark blue uniform of the building's security team. His name tag read Marcus Thorne, head of security. He approached her with a deliberate casualness, pretending to check something on the radio clipped to his shoulder. "I've worked here for 20 years, he began, his voice barely a murmur. He angled his body to shield their conversation from the crowd, then he looked her directly in the eye. "But I remember you from my last job. I saw you dance before." He paused, and the words he spoke next felt like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for a decade and a half. 15 years ago at the National Theatre, Kasia Moreau, principal soloist. Kasia's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, frantic bird. It was a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in years, a name she had buried along with her pointe shoes. Someone new, after all these years of hiding in plain sight, of taking anonymous, backbreaking jobs to pay for rent and groceries. Someone had pierced her disguise, I thought. "I thought you died in the accident," Marcus continued, his eyes a mixture of shock, awe, and a deep, profound respect. "The newspapers said you'd never dance again." "The newspapers said a lot of things," Kasia replied, her voice remarkably steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Not all of it was true." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over William Thompson, who was now counting his winnings with performative glee. "What they did to you, the way the ballet world just forgot you, that was an injustice," he said, his voice laced with a quiet anger. "And what they're doing now," he glanced back at William, "is even worse." In that moment, with the validation of his recognition, Kasia made a decision. It wasn't just about the dance, it was about resurrecting Kasia Moreau. Not just for them, but for herself. It was time to stop being a ghost. "Marcus," she said, her voice firm, "I need a favor. After I dance, no matter what happens, I need you to record everything that follows, especially the reactions. Get it all." He looked at her, confused, but then a slow understanding dawned in his eyes. He nodded, a silent promise passing between them, of course. But why? For the first time that night, a genuine smile, sharp and brilliant, lit up Kasia's face. Because some people need to be reminded that underestimating someone based on their appearance can be the most expensive mistake of their lives. As if on cue, William decided to add another layer of cruelty to his spectacle. "You know what?" he shouted to the room. "Let's make this more interesting. If she can finish the song without falling or stopping, I'll give her $1,000 out of my own pocket. But when she fails, and she will fail, I want her to clean this entire ballroom floor, on her hands and knees, in front of all of us. A few uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the crowd. For some, the line had been crossed. The sport was no longer amusing. It was grotesque. But no one, not a single soul, had the courage to confront the man who signed their paychecks and invited them to his exclusive parties. Dad, Jonathan tried one last time, his voice strained. This has gone too far. Shut up, Jonathan, William snapped. His patience gone. You're too soft. That's exactly why you need to learn how the real world works. There's a natural hierarchy, and people like her, he pointed a contemptuous finger at Kesha, need to know their place. It was that phrase, know their place, that finally severed the last thread of Kesha's restraint. She began to move, not towards the dance floor, but in a series of slow, deliberate stretches. The movements were subtle, an elegant rotation of an ankle, a graceful extension of an arm, a slow, controlled articulation of her spine. To the ignorant crowd, it looked like nervous fidgeting, but Marcus, watching from the side, recognized them immediately. They were the preparatory exercises she used to perform in the wings of the National Theatre, her pre-performance ritual. My God, Marcus muttered to himself, raising his phone discreetly. She's really going to do this. Victoria Thompson, noticing the attention shifting back to her challenger, decided it was time to end the charade. Start the music, she commanded the DJ with an imperious wave. Let's get this over with. The DJ, a young man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, queued up a classical waltz. The melody of Strauss's The Blue Danube filled the room. Victoria began to dance alone, her movements competent but soulless. They were the steps of a wealthy hobbyist, learned in expensive private lessons. Her technique was clean, her posture erect, but it was mechanical, lacking the passion and artistry that separates a dancer from an artist. She was executing a routine. Still, the biased audience gave her a round of polite, obligatory applause. She represented them, rich, white, educated in all the right social graces. She was safe. Well done, dear, William said, applauding with exaggerated enthusiasm. A class act, as always. Now, let's see what our guest artist has to offer. All eyes turned to Kesha as she walked slowly to the center of the dance floor. Each step was measured, controlled, imbued with a quiet dignity that was beginning to unnerve the crowd. This was not the posture of a woman about to be humiliated. This was the calm, centered walk of a professional taking her stage. What song would you like? The DJ asked, his tone now tinged with a respect that hadn't been there before. The same one, Kesha replied simply. But from the beginning, William laughed. Oh, she wants a second chance. How touching. All right, play the song. Let's see how long she lasts before she runs for the exit. What none of them knew was that the choice of song was not random. It was strategic. It was a waltz she had danced hundreds, perhaps thousands, of times. A piece whose every note, every swell, every nuance was encoded in her muscle memory. More importantly, it was the music from her final performance before the accident. The night she had received a 5-minute standing ovation at the National Theatre. A performance one critic had described as transcendent, a heartbreakingly beautiful display that solidifies Kesha Maro's place in the pantheon of American dance. As she stood alone in the center of the vast marble expanse, Kesha closed her eyes. She shut out the 200 pairs of condescending eyes, the opulent ballroom, the memory of the shattering glass. She let the opening notes of the waltz wash over her and allowed her memory to transport her back 15 years. She wasn't Kesha Williams, the cleaner, anymore. She was Kesha Maro, the artist. She felt the familial connection to the music, the certainty that she was born for this. The doctors had said she would never dance again. The media had written her career's obituary. For years, she had believed them. But while she had never returned to the stage, she had never truly stopped dancing. In the privacy of her small apartment, late at night when the city slept, she had danced through the pain, through the grief, through the quiet desperation of a life rebuilt from ashes. The music began its iconic opening bars. Something extraordinary was about to happen. In that room full of prejudice and power, under the crushing weight of their judgment, Kesha's hands came up, her arms positioning themselves into a perfect, classical fifth position. The precision of the gesture, so clean and effortless, made a few of the guests, the ones with a passing knowledge of ballet, frown in confusion. They were about to witness something far beyond a simple amateur dance. But not even they could have imagined that those first few notes would mark not only the rebirth of a lost legend, but the moment when the entire power structure of their world would be shaken to its very foundation. Asterisk, the first 8 bars of the Blue Danube are a quiet promise, a gentle summoning. For Victoria, they had been a cue. For Kesha, they were an invocation. As the familiar violins swelled, she did not step into a waltz box. Instead, with a fluidity that seemed to defy the very laws of physics, she rose and poinked. It was an impossible act. She was not wearing poink shoes. She was wearing the thin rubber-soled black flats that were part of her uniform. Yet, for a breathtaking moment, she balanced on the very tips of her toes, her body a perfect, unwavering line of grace and strength. A collective gasp, sharp and involuntary, swept through the ballroom. It was a sound of disbelief. This was not a waltz step. This was a declaration. Her first movements were slow, almost deceptively simple, a controlled port de bras, her arms carving through the air with a lyricism that spoke of years of relentless training. She allowed the audience to recalibrate, to let their low expectations shatter against this first display of impossible skill. But as the waltz's tempo gained momentum, so did she. The shy, subtle movements blossomed into something magnificent. Each step became more fluid, each turn more precise. She was no longer just dancing to the music, she was embodying it. Her body became the melody, her feet the rhythm, her movements a story of sorrow, resilience, and transcendent joy. William Thompson stopped laughing. His whiskey glass paused halfway to his lips, his smug expression melting into slack-jawed confusion. Beside him, Victoria's polite smile froze, then cracked, her face paling as she recognized the chasm of talent that separated her country club hobby from the masterful artistry unfolding before her. The entire room began to realize, with a dawning sense of awe and dread, that they were not watching a cleaning lady trying to dance. They were witnessing a master reclaiming her throne. "My God," a man in the front row murmured to his wife. She's exceptional." Kesha flowed into a series of Chana turns, spinning across the marble floor with a speed and precision that would challenge a seasoned professional. The turns ended not in a simple stop, but in a breathtaking grand jeet, a leap that launched her into the air, her legs extended in a perfect split. For a suspended moment, she seemed to hang there, weightless, a creature of pure light and air, before landing with the silent softness of a falling feather. This was not ballroom dancing. This was classical ballet of the highest possible order, masterfully and seamlessly adapted to the rhythm of the waltz. Marcus, true to his word, had his phone raised. He was no longer discreet. He filmed openly, panning from Kesha's magnificent performance to the sea of stunned faces. He zoomed in on William Thompson, whose expression had morphed from scorn to confusion, and was now curdling into something that looked terrifyingly like fear. "This is impossible," William whispered to himself, his voice a ragged, choked sound. "Who the hell is this woman?" The music swelled towards its first crescendo, and Kesha unleashed the sequence that had once been her signature. It was a unique fusion she had created herself, a blistering combination of Italian school allegro and Russian school expressiveness. It was a dance that existed in the memories of ballerines and on grainy recordings from 15 years ago. And as she performed it, the final pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place for some in the crowd. "Wait a minute," said a woman, adorned in pearls, a prominent patron of the arts who hadn't missed a major performance at Lincoln Center in 3 decades. "I know those moves. I've seen that sequence before. But where?" She squinted, her mind racing through years of playbills and performances. Jonathan Thompson had forgotten he was supposed to be filming for his father's cruel posterity. His phone was still recording, but his arm had lowered, his eyes completely mesmerized. He was no longer the conflicted son of a tyrant. He was simply a witness to greatness. Unlike his father, he recognized genius when he saw it, regardless of the vessel in which it appeared. As the waltz reached its triumphant, soaring climax, Kesha prepared for her final statement. She moved to the center of the floor and began a series of fouette turns. One after another, 32 of them, a continuous, dizzying sequence of whipping turns, performed on one leg, a feat of technical brilliance and superhuman stamina that is the benchmark of a prima ballerina. The entire audience was speechless, their minds unable to reconcile the drab cleaner's uniform with the world-class performance they were witnessing. The final chords of the waltz echoed through the hall. Kesha did not end with a simple curtsy. She finished in a pose that was a perfect tableau of her story. One arm reaching towards the heavens in a gesture of hope, the other curved protectively over her heart, her head held high with an expression of absolute, unassailable dignity. Her chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, the only sign of the immense physical exertion she had just undertaken. The silence that followed the last note was more profound than any applause. It was a vacuum, a space of collective shock and reverence. It stretched for 5, then 10, then 15 seconds. It was the sound of 200 minds trying to process a miracle that then, slowly, a single person began to clap. It was Jonathan. His applause was hesitant at first, then grew in strength. Another person joined him, then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet, erupting in a thunderous, spontaneous ovation that was more passionate and sincere than any polite applause Victoria had received. It was a roar of approval, of awe, of apology. "Bravo!" someone shouted from the back. "Extraordinary!" echoed another. William Thompson was ashen, a statue carved from rage and humiliation. He had not just lost a bet. He had been publicly, spectacularly dismantled by the very person he had sought to destroy, and he had done it in front of the entire Manhattan elite, the people whose respect he craved above all else. They were no longer looking at him as a powerful leader. They were looking at him with a mixture of pity, disgust, and second-hand embarrassment. It was into this moment of raw, chaotic emotion that Marcus stepped forward, his phone still recording. He walked towards Kesha, his face a mask of pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his security guard's voice booming with an authority no one had ever heard from him before. "Allow me to introduce you to Kesha Merrow, former principal, soloist of the American National Ballet." The name fell into the room like a bomb. A wave of gasps and shocked exclamations followed. Kesha Merrow. The name resonated with the force of a legend, a prodigy who had vanished at the absolute zenith of her career after a tragic, career-ending accident. They pulled out their phones, furiously typing her name into search engines, the glowing screens illuminating faces of dawning comprehension. "Impossible," Victoria Thompson stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "Kesha Merrow she's dead, or at least, she never danced again after the accident." "Clearly," Kesha said, finally breaking her silence, her voice carrying easily across the still applauding room. "The rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated." A few people laughed, a release of the incredible tension, but William Thompson wasn't laughing. The full, catastrophic reality of what he had done was crashing down on him. He had publicly taunted, humiliated, and wagered on the dignity of one of the greatest performing artists in modern American history. And worse, he had done so while being recorded from multiple angles. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus said, turning his phone directly on the petrified man, "you made a bet. You said that if she danced better than your wife, you would marry her to your son. I believe this entire room can attest to the fact that the condition has been more than met." Jonathan, seeing his moment, stepped away from his father's shadow and approached Kesha. His eyes were filled with a sincere, profound admiration. "Miss Merrow," he said, his voice clear and steady, "I would like to publicly apologize for my father's behavior. It was abhorrent and inexcusable." "Jonathan, shut up." William finally exploded, his mask of control shattering completely. He was no longer a titan of industry. He was a cornered, panicked old man. "You will not apologize to anyone, especially not to her." It was then that Kesha revealed the true checkmate move in her strategy. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her tone calm and conversational, as if they were discussing the weather, "I believe we have a marriage proposal to discuss. After all, a man of your stature and public standing surely keeps his word, doesn't he?" The audience watched, rapt. This was no longer a dance-off, it was a high-stakes corporate takeover of a man's reputation. "You must be insane if you think I'm going to honor a drunken joke," William growled, his arrogance returning as a desperate last-ditch defense. But it wasn't just a joke, was it?" Kesha countered with a small, knowing smile. "Marcus, could you perhaps play back the recording of Mr. Thompson's statements from earlier this evening?" Marcus held up his phone. He hit play. William's own voice, clear as a bell, filled the silent room. The recording captured everything. The initial cruel bet, his goading of the crowd, his doubling down on the conditions, his smug confirmation that he would keep his word, and his final vile ultimatum that she clean the floor on her hands and knees. The recording was a perfect, undeniable indictment of his own making. "That's blackmail," William shouted, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, his composure utterly gone. "No," Kesha corrected him calmly. "This is accountability. You made a public wager, with clear terms, in front of 200 witnesses. Now you have a choice. You can decide if you are a man of your word, or if your reputation is worth less than your prejudice." Jonathan moved to stand beside Kesha, a definitive, symbolic act of alliance. He looked not at his father, but at her. "Miss Merrow," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "If you will allow me, I would like to honor my father's word, not because I am forced to, but because any man would be honored to marry someone of your talent, character, and dignity." A new wave of murmurs swept the room, this time of surprise and a touch of romance. William was visibly shaking with rage. "Jonathan, if you do this, you're out. Out of the company, out of the family, out of the will, out of everything." "Then so be it," Jonathan replied without hesitation. He extended his hand to Kesha. "Some things are more important than money, Dad. Things like integrity." Kesha looked at Jonathan's outstretched hand. Then she looked at the audience of stunned elites. Finally, her gaze settled on William Thompson, who looked as if he was on the verge of a complete nervous breakdown. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of her journey. 15 years ago, people like you decided I had no value because I was suddenly imperfect. Tonight, you tried to humiliate me based on the color of my skin and the uniform I wear to survive. But do you know what I've learned? True nobility doesn't come from a name, or a trust fund, or a skyscraper. It comes from how we treat other human beings, especially when we think no one is watching." She then turned her warm gaze to Jonathan. "Your son seems to have learned that lesson, despite your best efforts." She looked back at his still outstretched hand. As for the proposal, she smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her face. "I will accept an invitation to dinner with him, but marriage, well, that's something to people decide together, based on love and mutual respect, not on humiliating bets made by bullies." The ballroom erupted in applause again, louder and longer than before. This time, it was not just for the dance, it was for her grace, her intelligence, her indomitable spirit. It was for the profound lesson in class and character she had just delivered. William Thompson, defeated and utterly exposed, muttered something about lawyers and fled the ballroom, his wife Victoria trailing in his wake like a discarded shadow. He had lost everything that mattered to him in the space of a single waltz. Marcus finally stopped recording and grinned at Kesha. "This is going to be very interesting when it hits the internet." And as the elite of Manhattan buzzed with the story they would be telling for years, a story of prejudice, humility, and the vast difference between social class and true class. One question hung in the air. How would a man who built his empire on his reputation survive the fact that his own arrogance had just handed the world the means to tear it all down? The answer came with the brutal speed of the digital age. Marcus's video, uploaded under the simple title William Thompson's Waltz, became a viral supernova. By morning, it was the #1 trending topic worldwide. News outlets from CNN to the BBC picked it up. The headline was irresistible. "Billionaire humiliates cleaning lady, discovers she's a lost ballet legend." William Thompson, 3, woke up to a world that had turned on him. His company's stock had plummeted in pre-market trading. 3 major partners, citing a violation of their corporate social responsibility clauses, had already pulled out of 9-figure contracts. His wife, Victoria, had locked herself in a guest wing of their penthouse. Her only communication, a text to her lawyer demanding the immediate initiation of divorce proceedings. "Dad," Jonathan said, finding his father in his sprawling home office surrounded by newspapers and tablets, all displaying his own sneering face. "The board held an emergency meeting an hour ago. It was unanimous. You have until noon to announce your resignation, or they will remove you by force." William looked at his son, truly seeing him for the first time. The quiet, malleable boy was gone, replaced by a man of calm, unyielding resolve. "You did this," William murmured, his voice hollow. "You betrayed me." "No," Jonathan replied, his voice devoid of anger, only a sad finality. "You betrayed yourself. You did it the moment you decided your arrogance was worth more than another person's humanity." Meanwhile, Kesha's world was exploding in a different way. Her phone, a simple prepaid device, had gone into meltdown from the sheer volume of calls and texts. 3 of the world's most prestigious ballet companies wanted her as a guest choreographer. The director of Lincoln Center had called personally, offering her a one-night-only solo event, Cashmere, The Return. Hollywood producers were already in a bidding war for the film rights to her life story, but the offer that made her weep came in a crumpled envelope, delivered by a young boy from her old neighborhood. It was from the children at the community center where she had taught dance for free before her savings ran out and she had to take the cleaning job. They had pooled their allowances and lunch money, $23.47 in total, to offer her a scholarship to come back and be their teacher again. "I'll take it," Kesha said through tears to the reporters, who had somehow found her, "but on one condition. We turn this into something much, much bigger." 6 months later, the Kesha Mero Center for the Arts opened its doors in a beautifully refurbished warehouse in the heart of the city. It was funded by a flood of donations that had poured in from every corner of the globe after her story went viral. The center's mission was simple: to provide world-class arts education to any child, regardless of their background or ability to pay. Jonathan Thompson, now CEO of a completely restructured and ethically focused Thompson Corp., was its first and largest donor. William Thompson, stripped of his company, his reputation, and his family, vanished from the public eye. The last rumor was that he was working as a low-level consultant for a small firm in Delaware, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had once been his kingdom. At the center's grand opening, Marcus stood beside Kesha, watching a diverse class of smiling children attempt their first plies. "You know what impresses me most about all this?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It wasn't just a victory over one bigot. It was a lesson in how nobility responds to cruelty. You didn't just tear him down. You built something better in his place." Kesha, once again recognized as one of the greatest artists of her generation, smiled as she watched one of her students, a little girl with bright eyes and worn-out sneakers, finally nailed her first pirouette. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we have to lose everything to discover who we really are, and sometimes people have to lose everything to learn who they should never have tried to be." Jonathan approached, holding a small bouquet of flowers he'd picked from the rooftop garden he had personally funded and planted for the center. "Ready for that dinner?" he asked, offering his arm. "Ready," she replied, accepting his arm, and with it, the new life she had built, not from the ashes of her old one, but from the strength she had found within them. Her true revenge wasn't the destruction of William Thompson, it was the creation of a legacy of beauty and hope, proving that his cruelty was, in the end, insignificant. She had shown the world that when you face prejudice with dignity and answer hatred with excellence, you don't just win a battle, you change the terms of the war.